Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Caroline Hernandez. I'm at the Energy Resources Center at the University of Illinois, Chicago. We facilitate the Rights of Way Habitat Working Group, which provides a forum for the information exchange and development of best management practices that promote habitat on working landscapes, such as utility and transportation rights of way. We are excited to host this upcoming webinar series on the ins and outs of implementing habitat on rights of way. Today's webinar is the first in the series, where we will dive into details of using native seeds on habitat restoration. We have several other webinars in development that will cover developing habitat-oriented management plans, enhancing existing vegetation for habitat and ongoing maintenance, monitoring habitat on rights of way, and telling your habitat story. So stay tuned for more details coming in the next weeks. I want to briefly mention that our next working group meeting will be held in conjunction with the Trees and Utilities Conference on September 9th and 10th in Cincinnati, Ohio. We will be featuring a variety of industry updates and technical presentations with a focus on green contracting to help advance habitat initiatives on rights of way. We will also have working sessions and networking opportunities. For more information, you can visit our website. We also post relevant news on this website, best management practices, planning tools, and other resources, in addition to general information about the Rights of Way Habitat Working Group, upcoming events, working group tools, and past meeting proceedings. In a few days, there will also be a link to a recording of this webinar, along with recordings of all past webinars. As far as logistics for today, everyone is on mute except for myself and the presenters. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat box in GoToWebinar, and we will respond as best we can. If you have any questions for the presenters related to the contents of today's webinar, type those into the chat box as well. We have built some time in at the end of the presentation for questions, but please submit them at any time during the webinar. And finally, as I mentioned before, we will post a recording of this webinar on the Rights of Way Habitat Working Group website over the next week or so. So with that, let's turn to our topic for today. We are excited to have a breadth and depth of seeding expertise represented on today's webinar. Jesse Strinmoen from Shooting Star Native Seed, Mark Feely from Ernst Seed, and John Seymour from Roundstone Native Seed will each share their knowledge and experience on a variety of native seeding topics. Then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A and questions you submit during the webinar, or those that you submitted when you registered. Mike Rederer from Pheasants Forever will also be available during the Q&A to help questions. Before I turn things over to our speakers, let me provide a few quick introductions. Jessie Strinmoen is a manager at Shooting Star Native Seeds. She manages native seed sales for CRP and landowner restoration projects. Each year, Shooting Star helps to restore tens of thousands of acres of native prairies and wetlands in commercial, municipal, and private projects across the Midwest. Mark Feely has been a horticulturist for Ernst Conservation Seeds since 1995. He serves on Ernst marketing, planting, and harvest committees. Among his responsibilities are planting, prospecting, development of seed dormancy, breaking protocols, and formulation of seed mixes. John Seymour is a co-founder, co-owner, and president of Roundstone Native Seed. Based out of Upton, Kentucky, he oversees all of Roundstone's productions, as well as their installation and maintenance business. Roundstone has been collecting, producing, and harvesting, cleaning, and installing native grasses, wildflowers, and wetland species for 25 years. Mike Rederer is a coordinating wildlife biologist for Pheasants Forever and serves as the state coordinator for the Ohio Pollinator Habitat Initiative and for Pollinator Partnerships Project Wingspan. Mike works with private landowners in multiple states and federal agencies to provide technical assistance regarding the implementation of specific conservation measures and programs to improve native pollinator and wildlife habitat. And now, please welcome Jessie Strinmoen.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Caroline, for organizing this webinar and for the opportunity to share more about what we're all very passionate about. I'm working to get my clicking. Here we go. As Caroline mentioned, my name is Jessie Strinmone, and I am with Shooting Star Native Seeds. We're located in southeast Minnesota and serve customers throughout the Midwest. So today I'm going to do my best to speak on behalf of the entire seed industry or native seed industry and talk a little bit more about seed mix design and then seed sourcing and supply. But first, one of the things that I love about my work is that I get to talk to customers all day long, and they're talking about buying native seed. So it might be a landowner or someone working for a habitat organization. It might be a government organization like a DOT or a DNR. It might be another seed company or utility company. But they're all talking about the same thing, seed mixes. But their purpose and their intent for the project is so different. They may be coming to establish pollinator or wildlife habitat. They might be focused on erosion control or water quality or soil quality. They might feel a responsibility to the land and restoring what once was, or they may simply not want to mow. So natives serve so many of those purposes and a different purpose for each customer. So part of our jobs as a seed company is to learn what your purpose is, as well as what site conditions you're working with, and then help offer a mix that will be successful for your project. So kind of diving right in, that really is the first thing that we want our customers to think about is the purpose and the goals you have for your seed mix. So what purpose do you want your prairies to serve? Pollinators, habitat, erosion, all of those things I listed off. But also, what do you want it to look like and do and be in 5 and 10 or 50 years? So that's kind of the first thing to think about as you think about seed mix design. Second, of course, is budget. And native plants obviously take less time and money to maintain in the long run, but require quite an investment up front. So there's a huge cost range for mixes depending on the diversity and the species within the mix. So we see mixes from, just for example, $60 an acre to several $1,000s an acre. And it just depends on what species go into the mix. So that's, of course, something to consider. Conducting a site assessment. Our two other presenters will dive into this a little bit more, but when you come to a seed company to purchase seed, it's important that you're armed with a little bit of information about your site to help us determine what species are best suited for your project. So things like what kind of soil do you have? How well does the water drain? Is the site sloped? How much sun do you get? What's already growing? Are there any structures near the site that would hinder a burn and other maintenance efforts? And how large is the site? So all of these factors are used to determine what kind of seed mix you need for your project. So you'll want to bring this information forward to the seed company you're working with, and we can make recommendations based on all of these pieces. So the other piece of information that our recommendations come with is the knowledge of cost and availability, which helps you utilize reasonably priced mixes when necessary. So, it is important to remember some companies have pre-designed and pre-bagged mixes. Others work to customize your mix a bit more. And of course, there are some special considerations as you're thinking about pollinator mixes. Really quickly, you're looking for species that bloom throughout the growing season, species that are attractive to different pollinators. There's lots of beautiful flowers that have zero pollinator values. So you want to make sure you're choosing the right species, the right amount of diversity, and then the right seeding rate so you have the established porbs that you need. So kind of diving into the second part here to talk about seed sourcing and supply. Obviously, high quality seed is a crucial component to every successful restoration project. You purchase inferior seed, it really isn't going to matter how well the site is planted or prepped or how much effort you put into controlling the competition. You just won't get a successful stand. So you'll hear, as you're kind of diving into this, you'll hear lots of talk about local ecotype and local ecoregion seed. So I'm sure we'll kind of talk about this throughout the presentation today, but we all know that there are some projects that require origins from as close to the project site as possible. So these tend to be located near remnants or when you're doing true restoration work. This can be a really good thing, but it's important to understand that there's a cost to these stricter requirements. So if you're looking for seed from within, say, 25 miles of your site, it probably isn't doable, and if it is, it's going to get really expensive. So you may be limiting yourself to only seed harvested off the prairies in the area and then not seed that's commercially produced. So for other projects, it's just really important that you choose seed from the same ecoregion that is similar growing conditions. So for most roadway and other rights-of-way projects, seed from the same ecoregion will be successful. So for example, Minnesota origin seed can likely be used throughout most of the Midwest. Texas seed cannot. So local origin seed, or local ecotype seed, as it's sometimes called, is acclimated to those soils, climates, the rainfall of your region. So it'll outperform seed from outside of your region. Now, there's some disagreement in the seed world about what constitutes local, but I think from most of our perspectives, seed from the same general ecoregion will establish successfully. So, and some of that depends on the species. Some species can travel farther than other species and be successful. One thing I wanted to make sure to note was that most seed companies carry multiple lots of each species. So, even at Shooting Star, we work with different contract growers, people who are collecting, other seed companies, all of these to widen the selection of origins that are available. So even if we're located in Minnesota, we carry ecotype from, say, Ohio to South Dakota, northern Minnesota to southern Missouri. So, and I think that's pretty true of the three of us that are on the phone today. So all of us will work to make sure that we have origins that match the needs of your project. So the second one kind of goes without saying, and it's, we'd like to mention, choose a reputable vendor. And we hope that doesn't need to be said, but I think maybe a reminder might be a good idea. Reputable vendors are truthful in labeling. They know how to test species legally and accurately. They keep the appropriate records, and quite honestly, we play by the rules. So like any industry, there are some seed vendors who are not reputable, and the label may not match what is actually inside your bag. So you need to know that the seed has been harvested, cleaned, and stored properly. So I wanted to just kind of dive into a few things to kind of understand when you're thinking about seed mix design and seed sourcing. So the first is that seed mixes are generally designed by either seed count, which is seeds per square foot, or sometimes by pounds per acre. So seeds are very different in size and weight as you go from species to species, so it makes sense to focus on the number of plants that you're looking to establish. There's some programs that have different requirements for how many seeds per square foot you must have in a mix. So some CRP mixes, for example, you might see from certain states have a really low seeding rate. It might be 25 seeds per square foot. Most mixes that we have or that we do will shoot for 40 to 60 seeds per square foot. Wetter areas of higher erosion generally see an increased seeding rate. And then, of course, all of this depends on what species you're actually using. So there's a lot of variables that go into that calculation. But we just kind of wanted to make you aware of that today so that you can ask the right questions. The next bullet here is pure live seed. So pure live seed, or PLS, is a measurement that takes into account testing information for each species. So when you buy 1 pound of pure live seed from a seed vendor, you may actually receive 1.2 bulk pounds in the mail. So this accounts for the inert matter, the weed seed, the other crop seed, as well as purity and germination information that comes from the test on that species. So this can be a source of confusion with inspectors and contractors because they may say, I ordered 8 pounds to the acre, but this bag tells me I got 8.5. So how am I supposed to set my drill? So that's important to understand how those calculations work, but it's also important to make sure you're purchasing seed on a pure live seed basis. So all of that seed should be accompanied by a seed tag that details exactly the testing information that goes with each species. I mentioned inert matter. You certainly don't want to buy seed with a high percentage of inert matter, mostly because it will cause problems when drilling and broadcasting. You'll want to make sure you buy seed that has been properly stored under temperature and humidity control. So buying from your neighbor who stored it out in the shed might not be the best idea. And then, lastly, we always tell people not to let price be the only determining factor when you're purchasing seed. So What we see often is either specs or bids that come out that say, we're accepting bids on a pollinator mix. Well, like I mentioned before, pollinator mixes can range from hundreds of dollars an acre or, $60 an acre to several $1,000s an acre. So if you are putting something out for bid, you want to make sure that it's a mix so that people are bidding on the exact same thing. So you're putting out an actual recipe so you can compare apples to apples. So, and one more note about price, Shooting Star, and I think these other seed companies will likely be the ones to also say that, price shouldn't be your determining factor. And there are many times when Shooting Star is not going to be the cheapest place you can buy seed. But we're going to play by the rules, and it's going to be tested and labeled and all of those things that make it a good purchase. So it's important to kind of weigh those factors as you think about price of a product. Okay, so lastly, seed labels or seed tags. Seed tags differ from state to state. There's different requirements about what has to be printed on a tag. So I'm going to show you a sample seed tag from a pollinator mix that's coming out of Shooting Star. It's missing the middle section. I just ran out of space so that you could see that. But I just want to kind of walk through this so you know what the main components of a seed tag are. So I'm going to move my mouse here so you can see. Usually you have the vendor information, contact information up here on the top somewhere. You'll have a name of the mix, a description of the mix, and then information about the total acres or the total pounds or some identifying factor. You will always have seeding rates up here. And again, this is kind of the source of confusion for some folks who are on the ground doing the work. So you'll see the bulk pounds per acre, and that's often different than what they ordered in PLS. So that's something to make sure you understand. A couple of components to the seed tag I'll just point out. We're not going to go into huge details of them, but over on these couple of first columns, you'll see the mix percentage. That's by weight. You'll see the PLS, pure live seed pounds, and then the bulk pounds for each species. You'll see the lot number. So that's our identification number for which lot of seed we're using from our inventory. It's our responsibility to track seed from the point of it's seeded in the ground to the point that it leaves our door. So we know the path of ownership throughout that. You'll see common names, scientific names. There's some discrepancies among mostly common names where there's multiple common names used for scientific names, and then even some discrepancies in scientific names. So, you can certainly dig into that a little bit more, but just know that it may look a little bit different than what you maybe ordered or spec'd out. Variety will be listed there if there is a variety to the species. Its origin, sometimes this is listed to the state level, sometimes it's listed to the county level, but that is always included in our tags. And then the next few sections come from the test of each species. So you see information about the purity, the germination, the percentage of dormant seed, TZ, which is a different test that's available, and then the total on the far right. There's always it's called an AMS number. It's a identification number of the seed company. So again, that assists with the tracking from how a mix has traveled. And then total information, purity, inert matter, other crop or weed seed, and then Minnesota State the seed law requires that noxious weed seeds be listed if there are any in the mix. So that's kind of the short story on what a seed tag might look like. But again, each state is a little bit different in what they require, but the same general principles will apply. So that is my introduction to seed mix design, seed sourcing, and seed supply. With that, I will turn it over to Andy Ernst, who's going to talk a little bit more about the installation part of seed mix or native seeds. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me?
Hi, Mark. We can hear you.
Okay. Just want to make sure. Let's see if I've got the controls working. Ah, I do. Good. All right. For many seeding projects, the time to plant is when the bulldozer stops rolling. In a perfect world, the date for planting would occur between a killing frost in fall and 6 weeks prior to onset of summer drought. An advantage of using native species in your plantings is the presence of seed dormancy. That means that for a given species, not all seed will germinate immediately after being planted. Those seeds that don't provide a hedge against unfavorable growing conditions at the time of planting. For sites planted outside our ideal seeding window, we might improve upon our hedge by increasing our seeding rate by 50% to increase the total quantity of dormant seed that is being planted. Whenever planting a site with native species, a site evaluation should be done. Aspects to assess include what weeds and desirable species are growing on and around the site, soil type, hydrology, slope, fertility, and potential for erosion. These are pieces of information you can share with your supplier. In a perfect world, there would be no major weed issues on or surrounding a site to be planted. In the real world, often weeds present a challenge to establishing native habitat. It is typically far easier to control perennial weeds prior to planting than after. Many annual weeds, such as foxtail and ragweed, may be controlled with a few trimmings of a site during the establishment year. Typically, these are not a problem in the second growing season, provided that there is no further disturbance of the soil and you have a healthy stand of native species. Perennial weeds, those weeds which grow for multiple years, pose a different challenge than annual weeds. If not controlled prior to seeding, they have the potential to be long-term problems. Many of these weeds have extensive or large diameter roots that are difficult to kill. Full control of these weeds may take more than one control method. With some weed species, it is wise to apply control measures in areas that are outside the planting so that those areas that are infested with these problems weeds will not be donor sites to the area that you are planting. Amongst the herbicides that are used to control problem weeds, many are systemic, and they are used to control, one of the means by which they control weeds is through long residual periods. This is when the chemistry is still active in the soil, and that chemistry's continued activity in the soil means that susceptible species planted during that residual period may fail to establish. When there are problem weeds present on your site, one tool in the weed control program is to use a temporary seeding to stabilize the site during the period of weed control. Following control, the meadow would be planted at the appropriate time. For our temporary seedings, we would typically use oats, rye, or brown top millet. Our experience is that the temporary crop provides shade, which enhances the effectiveness of certain herbicides that are applied. This is particularly true if the temporary crop stand is thick enough to provide that shade. Weeds not controlled prior to planting will need to be controlled after planting, possibly by spot spraying with a non-selective herbicide such as Roundup or a selective herbicide. If the weed problem is sufficiently bad, a broadcast use of selective herbicide may be necessary. For some sites, a good strategy is to plant herbicide-resistant native seed mixes coupled with the use of appropriate herbicides to control perennial weeds that persist after planting. Success with this strategy is dependent upon having a good knowledge of what weeds are present. Success with this strategy also can be dependent upon use of appropriate rates and good timing of the herbicide application. In eastern North America, native seed mixes can be formulated that are resistant to milestone, stinger, spur, or transline, or plateau or journey herbicides. It can be helpful to know what desirable species are currently on or around your site as these can give seed companies a hint as to what additional species will be well suited to your site. This information will also be helpful if you're going to be in a monitoring program to show what site improvements have been made. Knowing your soil is also important. We want to identify what we have to work with. So when we look at our topsoil, one aspect of that is the texture, which is a classification based on the percentage of sand, silt, and clay. When determining this soil texture, an excellent resource is the Web Soil Survey, which will give a breakdown of a typical soil profile based on various soil types. Some information that can be found in this description is soil makeup, high water tables, erosion potential, and many other physical characteristics that would exist if the soil was undisturbed. This information can help to determine what species will do best in that location. Sandy soil has a higher potential for drought, but is better able to be worked without concern for compaction. Clay is the soil component that holds nutrients. However, clay soils have a high potential for compaction. Soil nutrients, in addition to be held up by clay, are also held onto by organic matter. Typically, sandy soils with low organic matter have poor or low fertility. Okay, and bear with me a moment. This slide shows a soil test taken from a Superfund site in western Pennsylvania. On the analysis, you will notice that the potassium and phosphorus levels are falling into the low optimum range. Magnesium and pH are below optimum. These rates are not so low, though, that we would adjust the pH or the magnesium. You might consider it, but again, it's not absolutely necessary. In particular, one thing to be careful of is not to add nitrogen when you're planting native meadows on soils that have a decent level of fertility, because the nitrogen will feed the weeds, and the weeds will create competition for your native species. It is important to take a soil sample to find out if there are any issues to be addressed prior to planting. Some analytic labs will provide fertility recommendations for warm season grasses or the Conservation Reserve Program. This analysis is most appropriate for meadow plantings. Often there is not a need for fertilizer application except for sites where the original topsoil is not in place. Your soil test data may be shared with your seed provider to see if any fertilizer application is warranted. But again, in the case of a testing lab such as Penn State, they're going to give you a reasonable recommendation when you ask for the warm season grass or the CRP analysis to be done for your site. Oops. What type of site are you working with? Is there fresh dirt to work with? Will you be renovating an existing site or a combination of the two? Your options may be controlled by available equipment. Three of the standard seeding methods are shown in this photo: a hydro seeder, an ATV broadcast seeder, and a no-till drill. Options will be impacted by the seeding method available. The no-till drill gives the most uniform seeding and the best seed-to-soil placement. Both hydroseeding and broadcasting require the soil to be completely exposed for good seed-to-soil contact. One of the common methods of a hydroseed, one of the common approaches when hydroseeding is to blow 500 pounds of hydromulch with the seed to identify where you've been with your hydroseeder, and then to blow 1,000 pounds over top. By doing this, your seed will be placed close to the ground, and it will not be suspended in the mulch, and therefore have difficulty rooting into the soil. John will be addressing planting in greater detail, but another point that I'd like to bring up here is that many of you may be considering the renovation of an existing site, and some of these sites have existing sod on them that needs to be addressed. In the Northeast, it has been our experience that direct seeding into old sod, even when there has been an application of Roundup to kill the foliage, can still leave a problem with no-till drilling. This may be, and I'll leave this to John's discretion to comment on this, be less problematic as you move south. The photo in the upper left corner shows a site that was killed with Roundup last fall. It may look perfect, like a perfect site for no-till drilling, but there's still need for some type of tillage to loosen the sod. Here we're using a particular, sorry about that. Here we're using a particular minimum tillage piece of equipment to loosen up the site that we're on there. And this image here, you see that we have, again, the same piece that was being used up in the upper left-hand corner. Down below there is a chisel plow, an aerator, I think is another name, and anyway, different pieces of equipment can achieve the same ends. A disc harrow would be part of that. By nature, many construction sites have compaction issues which limit plant growth and the movement of water through the soil. It is caused by driving over an area with heavy equipment or by working wet soil. After construction, properly working the soil to a depth of 2 to 4 inches can create a seed bed that will allow good plant growth. Roots of some native species have the ability to loosen or penetrate compacted soils as they grow. This facilitates improved water percolation. By giving plants a good start, you allow them to enhance the site. We have observed soil pits where the roots of native species are over 4 feet deep in heavy clays. We sometimes receive the question of how wet is too wet to work a site. If you take some soil, try to press it into a ball in your hand, and then if you're able, press your thumb into the ball. If the soil's dry enough, it'll just crumble apart. If your thumb goes into the ball without breaking apart, the soil needs to dry before proceeding. Thank you very much.
Okay, Jesse, are we good? Caroline?
I think you're good to go, John.
Okay. All right, hey guys, this is John Seymour with Roundstone Native Seed. Just going to go through planting methods and kind of what to expect. I'll be reiterating just a little bit. Try not to bore you with what everybody else has already previously talked about, but just going to hit on some of those high points. So bear with me here. I got a lot of slides, but it's okay because I talk fast. We have time for questions at the end. All right, so we're going to talk about planting methods, but first let's talk about what we're planting. Now, this nasty mess that you're looking at on your screen right now, that is actually a seed right after it's been harvested. I put out there the worst case scenario. This is needle and thread grass. This is more of a Midwestern grass, but oftentimes seed producers, this is what we end up with coming out of the harvesting equipment. So by the time we get it to you, we have to make sure that it is in a fitting position or condition that you can utilize it. So basically what seed producers do is we bring it in and we try and condition it. That is to get it to the point that it is flowable, cleanable, and basically we clean things by size, shape, weight, texture, specific weight, length, and that sort of thing. And then once we get it to that point, on the picture on your left-hand screen, it's just common Indian grass, yellow Indian grass, Sargassum nutans. And the furthest picture on your left is Indian grass as it has been debearded. And basically right beside of it, it still has the beards and awns maintained on it. So this can kind of mess up our seed count a little bit. So we try and stay consistent in what we do. And you will notice in the picture to the right-hand side, several different varieties of grasses and legumes, the one in the center being eastern gamma grass. So there's a lot of difference in size, shape, and seed count. The top row of seeds, this is basically Indian grass again, and you can see on the far left-hand side it has awn protruding out, and it has the beard sticking down. So if you could, please envision this as an object, say the size of a football. And basically these long hairs or stilts are holding it off the ground. This inhibits seed-to-soil contact, and it is much, much preferable that we have good seed-to-soil contact. In nature, that would fall in the fall, hit the ground, and have time for that to wear out. On the right-hand side is seed that it has been debearded and conditioned. This will help facilitate our cleaning, and it will also help facilitate it going through any type of planting methods or equipment that we utilize. On the bottom row right there, you're looking at little blue stem, and basically it's very similar. It has the awn, it has the beards. It's a little meaner looking, and we can slick it up just like that Indian grass. But if you look very closely at the far right-hand tip, I broke the tip of that off in the cleaning process, and when I did that, I killed that seed. So when you receive seed, some mixes you have will be very slick and very flowable and can go through most any type of cedar. Other types that utilize different types of seeds, such as these fluffy ones like little blue stem or Cytos grama or Virginia wild rye, it will be necessary that we leave them in a state that's a little more fluffy. Therefore, we need specialty equipment to do so. All right, how do we ensure we have a successful establishment? First, we're going to make a plan as we would do with anything. That plan may need to fluctuate a little bit. We will need to know the steps that we take, and if it has to fluctuate, then that's when we vary somewhat. Proper ground preparation, as Mark talked about, the correct planting depth, and then most times I speak, I tell people that we absolutely plant no deeper than 1/4 of an inch, and oftentimes we like to see part of that seed visible. The exception with that is deep sand. I realize we're talking to a lot of folks that are in different parts of the U.S., and our soils are going to change. Make sure we use the right seed for the right area. In doing so, if it's a specific job, you're talking to your biologist or your seed company, please utilize them to help you with that mix. Know what to expect, and that is to say, let's plan a little bit ahead and find out what plants we're planting and how they grow and what that time frame is. Also, use the right planting method, and make sure that we monitor the site. Don't just walk away from it. It's something that we'd like to check on periodically. All right, I won't go much over this as Mark did already, but basically tillage is just when we turn the soil up. We kill the vegetation by mechanical means. We are doing this with metal. So that's discs or cultivators. You can do it on a small scale or a large scale. One other thing I'd like to address, natives really like farm soil. They don't like compacted soil, just like Mark talked about. But because they don't like to be any deeper than 1/4 of an inch, we come back through with a cultipacker or a roller. So if you will look at the center picture, right in the center at the bottom, you can see a footprint. And to the left of that, where the cultipacker ran, you can barely see that. So we just call this the footprint test. And it's the same in the picture to the right on a smaller version where a roller was. Where it is fluffy, that's where we tend to get too deep as the rain comes down. All right, then we get into the method of broadcast seeding. So there's all types of broadcast seeders. There's handhelds, there's 3-point hitches, which are smaller units on the back of a tractor that we can do multiple acres. Or if you look in the picture at the very bottom where we're utilizing fertilizer spreaders where it is mixed in with a carrier. You'll notice in the picture on the far right, you're looking at some pieces of plastic, which are basically cable ties. Natives are fluffy. They are not always flowable. So we do whatever we can to make sure that we can agitate or stir. So if you use a broadcaster, just make sure you have some method to agitate it. All right, why is there a different in how the seed mixes look? We've addressed this a couple times. Again, I used a worst case scenario. That is a fairly typical 4 mix on your left. In the center, that is just happens to be wiregrass, more southern variety, but it is so delicate that that's about all we can do to it without killing the seed completely. So therefore, you can see from some companies something to that magnitude that it is that messy. That's not common, but it is possible. All right, so native seed is very expensive, and oftentimes you don't put a lot of pounds per acre. So to get it to go through and to get it to be flowable, we often use carriers. Kitty litter and pelletized lime are two that we utilize the most. And basically, kitty litter is clay bentonite. It's readily available. And pelletized lime is readily available at your farm service agency as well. So we normally mix this about bag per bag on volume. And then so basically what we've done is we've cultivated just like Mark said. We came in and we rolled it or packed it. And then we have broadcast our seed. And then we come back over with a roller or a color packer a second time. This makes sure that we have good seed to soil contact. In the picture on the right, you see a lot of seed. I put it on extra heavy just for emphasis so you could see what's there. But basically, some of the seed's below ground and some is visible on top. Hydroseeding, just like Mark talked about, we would utilize this method when we are dealing with very steep slopes or places that we can't necessarily get the other equipment down, or possibly to overcome any bonding or issues of time of year when we're planting and trying to get stands a little bit quicker. With the mulch that Mark talked about, the one thing we do want to be cautious of is our depth. Again, if it doesn't like to be much over a 1/4 inch, you can get too heavy. The rate that he explained is about optimal, but if we go much heavier than that, we can cause ourselves issues. With hydroseeding and broadcasting, we tend to put more seeds per pound than we would normally recommend because they don't always come up. They're not always getting the seed to soil contact that we do in the other methods. All right, so there are machines called drop seeders. This just happens to be a grass slender. There's easy flows and some other varieties, but basically it has a seed box that will force the fluffy seeds down. This is one that would utilize like the wiregrass we spoke of. You can use the discs in the front or not use them, but basically it meters out the seed, drops it on the ground, and then it is then pressed in with the tires below it. All right, consider site conditions. Top left-hand corner, could it possibly be just a touch dry? We also want to see on the top left, top right-hand corner, could it be a little bit wet? Conditions we need to know about. That's going to determine what types of machinery we use, or it may be that we can't get in there until the ground will let us as well. Bottom left, a steep slope. That particular slope we were able to get across with a seed drill, but if it gets much steeper than that, then we would opt for the hydro seeder option. Oftentimes we get into places that are extremely rough and rocky, especially on rights of way. So this is an instance where we do the best we can. We up our seed rate a little bit. We stir the soil best we can, and we would use a broadcast seeder on this particular type. We need to consider the state of the soil, how we can get better seed to soil contact. In these pictures, this is all common in rights of ways, whether it's gas line, power line, or even some roadsides, where companies have to follow behind forestry mulchers or just heavy debris. This is all doable. And the picture in the center, we know that's not going to erode because of the amount of mulch that's there, but we would hope to be able to let that sit for one season. Then we can come back with some of the equipment that Mark told you about and some of the discs and incorporate a little dirt to allow us to get seed to soil contact. And both the pictures on the left would be optimal for broadcast seeding. And then the one on the right, we've got it broken down enough that we can get no-till drills over that. So just to reiterate, proper site preparation is essential. We talked about planning initially. We've oftentimes showed up to job sites and it wasn't ready, and when it's not ready, then we know that we're not going to get the stand that we need to get. All right, so we talked about what makes us successful. Let's hit again on what makes us unsuccessful. So where Mark and I talk about differences, it seems like in the north, we are better off with complete tillage. They don't have the number of weed seasons that we have as we start to go further south, or maybe a little more westerly as well. So Weed competition is the #1 reason we have an unsuccessful stand. So I'll hit just a touch on herbicide application as well. In the Southeast, it is imperative that we utilize that. #2, just keep reiterating planting depth. If you get it too deep, it absolutely will not come up. #3 is improper ground preparation, which we just hit. And #4, improper herbicide application or timing. That is to say, maybe we hit it too early before the weeds came up, or maybe we put too much herbicide down before we planted as well. Our herbicide is strongly recommended and sometimes essential. So most of us are ecologists or conservationists or at least environmentalists. So I'm kind of speaking out of both sides of my mouth. I hate herbicide, but it is very necessary for my business and for what we do. We look at it, for lack of a better term, as kind of like chemotherapy. It is very necessary to utilize it for just a few times to ensure that we get rid of all the things that are bad so we can come back with the things that are good that we need to keep. Multiple pieces of machinery here. Again, this is just to show you that there's all kind of stuff out there for all kinds of sizes and types of jobs. All right, this may look a little more complicated than it is, but I'll just run through it real quick. Top left-hand corner was a Kentucky pasture. It had an initial burn down on it. If you go to the top right after that, I let part of that go just to see what would come up. And what you're seeing there, after a complete burn down, I killed everything visible, are all the seeds that came back from the seed bank. And basically that is ragweed, Johnson grass, and thistles. So if I had planted my natives in with that, that's still all it would be, because the natives cannot stand that kind of competition as they grow. The other part of the field, I had done a second herbicide burn down, bottom left-hand corner. That is what came back even after a second herbicide burn down. That is primarily Johnson grass, and Johnson grass is a 2-year seed, and so basically it came up after that. To the far right is 3 full herbicides, and now I have depleted the seed bank in the soil, and I'm ready to go in with a no-till drill. All right, so on the left, it's a native stand with proper weed control. It did its thing. It all came up. I'm very pleased with that. To the right is the exact same mix in an area that was missed with a sprayer. So again, we're seeing teasel and Johnson grass and crabgrass and that sort of thing. So I show you this just to stress how imperative it is that we get good weed control. No-till planting, basically when we talk about this term, it is in agriculture. But all we're doing is we're planting seed with a machine without disturbing the soil. These are just different types of no-till seeders. I put this up here just to let you know there are a lot of different ones out there. One thing on the center with the Great Plains drill that you're looking at, you will notice that even though it's a no-till drill, they have been so aggressive with the front coulters that they're actually disking it. So all they have done, even after they have herbicided, is essentially tilled it up, and now a new crop of weeds will come. So we don't want to get too aggressive with that. Things that make no-till drills for natives different than other common no-till drills is that most of them have a fluffy seed box. And if you look at the top left-hand corner, you're going to see a black auger or an agitator. That will keep the mixes that you purchase of natives in a suspension, the small seed, the big seed, the fluffy seed. And then at the bottom is basically a picker wheel. It looks kind of like a skill saw blade. So since natives are fluffy and they will not flow through gravity, what is necessary for us to do is use that picker to actually grab it and force the seed down. Another attribute of native drills is the oversized hoses. Anytime we are to get into species that have to have some inert matter such as a stick, that will keep them from clogging. And at the bottom you will see the trash plows. This is what runs in front of the coulters, and these just make a small incision in the sod where Mark said it is necessary to get seed to soil contact. And this will just lay over about a 1-inch ribbon and allow the coulters to come behind it and plant the seed behind that. Proper calibration is absolutely essential. Native seed is very, very expensive, and the last thing you want to do is run out of seed. And as a seed company, that's a very common call that we get. And as installers, when we come and do a custom job for somebody, if we run out of seed, it is our responsibility to replace it. And if we didn't put out enough, basically we have stolen from the landowner. So we tell you that to tell you this: proper calibration is not only essential, it's obtainable. So every drill has a method. It is worth taking the time to make sure that you do it right. Most of the time we have a postage scale or a small pin scale, and it is just a matter of a little bit of math, and we weigh up the amount of seed that comes out, possibly the number of revolutions per tire, but there's a formula for each one, and I encourage you to make sure that you do that accurately. All right, bottom left-hand corner, do not overfill your boxes. If you would, just please envision you have a mason jar and you fill it full of cotton balls. Then you grab another handful of cotton balls, and the more you stuff, the more you put in there. The same happens with native seed. So if we fill it 3/4 full and we calibrate it, and then we start putting more seed on top, because it is fluffy, you are actually putting more weight than what you initially calibrated. And this is one of the most common reasons people run out of seed. By the same token, on the right-hand side, if you let your boxes get down below much less than a third, then it becomes fluffier than fluffier because of agitators. And on the last part of your jobs, you will not be putting out the correct amount of seed. And when we talk about proper calibration, I put this picture in here just to show you that we can get down to almost 1/10 of an acre if we really try and be accurate. So it's obtainable to do small areas as well. Ground speed is very important. This is something we learned as a company the hard way. Basically, where the seed comes out in the double disc openers at the back, they are wheels and they spin, and that creates wind. And so since seeds are fluffy, oftentimes it will actually blow it up out of the trench that we're making instead of dropping it in it. So about 5.5 miles an hour is the optimum speed or maximum speed that we would recommend someone to drill at. On the right-hand side here, again, depth is critical. Plant no deeper than 1/4 of an inch. You can see the little trenches in there, and oftentimes this picture does not show it, but we would see a little bit of seed visible. All right, this picture is a broadcast seeding, but the reason it does not look uniform is you have 2 strips you're looking at. This was broadcasted, not packed. So where you're seeing the strips is where the tractor tires hit and the broadcast seed on top. The rest of it, because that sand and was loose, it got to be too deep. And the only part of the stand that was good is the part that was color packed or basically run over with the tractor. One last thing I would recommend is to make sure that you do as much straight line drilling as possible. These machines are long and they're not made to turn. And because you have a disc in the front and you're dropping the seed in the back, it can actually make it where it's not dropping into the trench. What do we expect and what do we know? The plant on the right is partridge peas. The plant on the left, on the other hand, is also partridge pea. That was planted in the same row from the same bag on the same day in the same field. The difference between natives and most of the other plants that we do is they have a very long germination window. If we went out today and we planted wheat and it rained today, wheat has about a 14-day germination window. It may come up within 2 days, but if it's much past 14, it's not going to come up. With native plants, by nature, because they have not been manipulated by breeding or anything else, they normally have a 70 to 80-day germination window. That's why you will look at your stands and they will look rough and haggard at first, and they come in a little better over time. This is something to keep into consideration when we top clip or if we're looking at putting more herbicides down. Both these pictures represent the one on the left is a broadcast seeding and sand. The one on the right is no-till. Lots of small plants. Some are just emerging. Some have been up for a while. I know that looks like a lot of ground space in between, but the good part about both these pictures is that there's proper weed control. Please keep in mind that most all natives are clump producing plants. That is to say they're not sod forming. So each one of the little seedlings that we saw in the previous picture, if given room, can make a plant the size of a wash tub if it's a grass or somewhere in between there. So for wildlife purposes especially, it behooves us to make sure that we do not get it too thick. All right, this is just some examples. The picture on the left is first-year growth. I'm pretty happy with that. We're getting late in the summer. The next is the beginning of the second-year growth. So you see the stubble and a few weeds that came in as well. That's very realistic. And you'll see the brown grass on the left. So it is already at the beginning of the growth season made it to the same height as it did the end of the first. And the picture to the far right is the end of the second-year growth. This is a production row, but this also just shows you the growth cycle. So I have a first year, a second year, and a third year growth. This just happens to be muley grass, but when we're looking out in the field and looking for our seedlings, this is the vision that we know is to come. And when Jesse talked about rates, we do thinner plantings for wildlife. There's lots of room in there around the clumps. Basically, grass is the habitat or the house structure, and then all the forbs are the things that provide food sources in amongst there, as well as the alleyways. More dense stands for habitat and ground cover, That'll service for both, and then very dense stands for heavy erosion control. So what Mark talked about was cover crops prior to planting to get our fields right. Oftentimes we also use nurse crops. The difference being a cover crop will hold the full field of soil. With nurse crops, we put in a much smaller recommended amount. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that it can too get just as thick as the weeds that choke out the natives. So we have to be very careful to use small amounts. And you'll see on the chart there, depending on the time of year, determines what type of annual crop that we would use. You'll see oats, annual rye, or a mixture of both, some millet, brown top, all these different things for different times, different rates. And you will see that wheat is absent from that. The reason being wheat has some allelopathic effects that will keep our natives from germinating. Nurse crops do really well to hold the soil while the natives establish. They don't just do that. When people come and they see the jobs that we do, they see that progress is being made, that something is done, and not only does it hold the soil, it kind of provides them, for lack of a better term, a magic trick. While the natives are establishing, they see that things are there. So public perception is big on these. So when we get into after our planting has been done, both of the top two pictures, the one on the left is primarily buttercups, and the one on the right is almost entirely ragweed. When I go out into this area, I take a 3-foot hula hoop and I pitch it out there, and I count the number of seedlings coming up. My natives are in there in all those pictures. However, it has got a lot of weed seeds, which were annuals. I did a good job in getting rid of the others. They do not concern me because since they're annuals, I will top clip or bush hog them off, and I will do that early on to provide sunlight and moisture to the native seedlings below it. And there's no reason I can't do that multiple times during the year, as long as when we come in to do the mowing, that we stay above the seedlings that we are trying to promote. And one of the last things I want to tell you about is when we do this top clipping, make sure that we don't wait too late. This is a common occurrence that we see, and once it gets to the point where it's like this, then the natives have basically been choked out already. And so we'll talk about the planting methods. I just want you to know that no matter what the type of job is, whether it's a steep slope, whether it's a wetland, whether it's flat or a large ag field, there are methods to utilize it. The equipment is not completely out of hand or unattainable, and the expense is not so bad that you can't utilize it. There are a lot of contractors out there. I think if you'll call most of your seed companies, they can probably direct you towards people to help you if you don't have them available to you. And lastly, here's some finished products of what we do. So I think that does it for myself. I hope that's been somewhat educational. And Caroline, I guess that's back to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Mark. I want to now go into, we've saved some time for questions. I want to remind everybody that there's a questions box that you can type your question into, and we will answer it as best we can. You will also have my email address, the email address on the information of how to sign into the webinar, and the email addresses of the speakers if you have further questions. So to begin, and I'm going to try and direct them as best as possible, but to begin, Jesse, could you repeat the application rate for mulch pounds per acre when hydroseeding? I believe that was you that spoke about it.
That was not me. I'm not sure.
That was me.
Mark?
Yeah, it's 500 pounds of hydromulch with the seed and 1,000 pounds over top.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, the next question. Has anyone had experience or success with activated carbon seedings? And I'm going to leave that up to all of you.
We had trialed some in production, but we didn't go far enough with it to say how well or not well it really does work.
I'm the same. That's not something we've had experience with.
Okay, thank you. Jesse, how many pounds of nurse crop do you recommend, oats or rye?
We typically see about 3/4 of a bushel of either oats or winter wheat is what we recommend in the Midwest, depending on the site conditions and the seed mix and, again, the intent.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
We're typically recommending 30 pounds of oats in the north from 1st of January to the end of July, and then 30 pounds of rye from 1st of August through the end of December as our cover crop rates. When you get below the Mason-Dixon, from May 1st to September 1st, we're recommending 10 pounds an acre of brown top millet.
Wonderful. Okay, next is how long after the third herbicide application can you start planting? Does anyone feel strongly about answering this one?
I'd be fine with taking this one if you can hear me okay.
We can hear you, John.
Okay. So I gave the scenario of 3 herbicide applications. It just depends on when we start. You know, we could start in the spring, summer, fall, but we still do multiple applications to make sure that we've gone through the seasons to kill it out. But how long do we wait after the last one? If we're just using something like glyphosate, which on the last herbicide usually is a cleanup, we can come in there as little as 6 to 7 days after. If we come across something that's still got woodies like Sericea lespedeza or blackberry briars or sumac or something like that, then we would need to use something for broadleafs like crossbow or pasture guard with triclopyr in it. And therefore, we have to wait basically, I think it's 1 week per pint. So that puts us back on planting. So we're very cautious when we make those recommendations.
Thank you. And John, can you also speak a little bit more about maximizing germination and how to properly combine that with appropriate erosion control?
Yes, ma'am. So we talk a lot about seed rates, whether we do it by pounds or seeds per square foot, and that can be a little dicey within itself. But what we do know is this, is that since they have a long germination window or a broad germination window, when we need to get vegetation down, when that is first and foremost, it stands to reason we put more seed out. That way we will take the advantage of the ones that germ early. And now, yes, the ones that germ really late, they may get choked out by the early ones and perish. But we met our goal. We got quick erosion control down because of that. So in that way, we can still get diversity, but we get a quicker planting. It is not optimal for wildlife habitat, but when we talk about erosion control, that's a different animal.
Thank you. Mark or John, would one of you talk about types, I guess John spoke about this the most, but the types of drill seeders that you might recommend for rocky, uneven sites that require burying the seed?
If it's real rocky, I don't know if there's any that are going to work. How about you, John?
There's Truax has one called I believe it's a Rough Rider range planter, and it's made for that. We utilized it in strip mines. It is a little more expensive, and it's built very well. But in those instances, we primarily use broadcasting. I guess it would just depend on how rocky that is. But that's one of the only ones I know of that's made for that specific reason.
And they're a good outfit to work with if you, and the company's name is spelled T as in Tom, R as in Robert, U-A-X. They're a very good resource if you want to learn more about the product. They're worth calling and talking with them.
Thank you. All right, the next question is, I have a pollinator plot that was planted last fall. It looks great with the exception of being overrun with shepherd's purse. has been suggested to go in and clip the tops. If I can't get that done this spring, will it be a problem?
I would think if it was planted last fall and you could go across it right now and trim it, great. If it's, usually your annuals aren't as much of a problem after you get through the first growing season, the first full growing season.
And Mike, do you have some experience? Mike Rutter, do you have some experience with this as well?
Well, I was just going to mention, Mark's absolutely correct. The only issue that would be is that annual heading out and reseeding again, and then you have a new stock of fresh seed to deal with potentially later or into next year. So the clipping is essentially to keep it from heading out and producing new seed. So understanding that with it being an annual, if it has the chance to head out, you potentially will see it for another season, even with minimal disturbance or no disturbance, just from natural, conditions, weather, freezing, thawing, things like that, that would take course over the year. So problem to me would depend on, how heavy or infested it is. The species giving this again, probably not long-term, but probably would not look what they want it to in year one or in year two even, because they might have that influx of another round of that annual weed.
And I would contend anytime you're doing these perennials, if it's at all possible, when things get to knee high, trim them back to half that height through the 15th of September, and you should minimize those problems. Now, let's say you've done that, but for some reason you're seeing a flush of those annuals showing up the next year in pockets. Trim those areas. As soon as you start to see the plant coming into bloom, trim them down to that 8 inches in those areas, and that should get things back into check.
Thank you. All right, I have a question for Jesse. How long does a chosen seed mix typically persist before needing a new round of seeding and removal?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the first part?
Yeah. How long does a chosen seed mix typically persist before needing a new round of seeding and removal?
Oh, gosh, I don't know if I can answer that. I mean, it really just depends on what is in the mix and the maintenance that's given. And sometimes people's purposes and intent change over time. It may have started out as a grass seeding, and then along the lines they want to introduce pollinator species or something like that. So I don't know if there's any magic number to that. But keeping in mind that these prairies were here, for decades before any of us were. So they're designed to persist if given the right conditions.
If I can add on that one, if I had a meadow that was dominated by where there was a lot of switchgrass in the mix, I could see that getting to a point where a lot of my flowers are suppressed that are shorter ones, and that would be a reason why I would do a renovation. But if I don't have, if I have a shorter grass sort of meadow to start with, or if the grasses are relatively in check in the first place, I've got a current meadow I'm monitoring that's in its 10th year, and it's looking fine and not showing any signs of issues. And certainly we see species persisting in the field without a problem 20 years after they were put out.
Yeah, if I can also reiterate what both of them have said, both Jesse and Mark, the only thing to understand is the higher the percentage of grasses in the mix will tend to lean towards grass domination over time. With like the entire, you'll have some species of your forbs that can last through that. It's just tendency that grasses will become more dominant over time. So whatever you plant, depending on your rates, it can persist over time. your composition may change slightly depending. So it may go from, a certain height structure or diversity to a different one over time. That's just, diversity and essentially how things work over time with succession.
Another thing that will affect that should be fire. I've been to prairies where certain species hadn't been seen in a number of years, and if you burned it, you got some of that diversity back in.
Great, thank you. John, will you elaborate on why wheat is not used as a cover crop for natives?
All right, so there's several scientific articles on this, and I've had the same experiences as well. So when we look at a wheat field, it is primarily clean. We don't have to put a lot of herbicides on wheat like we do other crops, and it has an allopathy. And basically, what it does is it is a chemical process put off by the roots that is a kind of a natural germination inhibitor. So when a lot of tobacco patches in Kentucky, we would go across pastures, and the tobacco patch would be in the middle where wheat was planted, and I had perfect stands everywhere except where I had the wheat. So I have had experiences where it was okay, but because I've had experiences where it was not, I choose not to use it just to hedge my bets to make sure that we're okay. I do not and have not seen any research with oats, millet, or rye.
I can concur with John. We've had the same experiences, even coming in plantings behind wheat fields where just the volunteer wheat has been able to grow and germinate. I will say, however, they have been winter wheat has been used as a cover crop or as a to get you from a fall bare ground disturbance to a spring seeding. As long as you're planning on killing off or spraying the wheat, you should be okay as long as you don't let it go too far in its stages to where that allelopathic tendencies will start to show up.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
Would one of you, Jesse, I think, briefly speak on urban soils, urban seed mixes, appearance during establishment period in urban settings?
Sure. We get a handful of customers who are looking to establish mostly pollinator mixes in urban settings. And of course, one of the things that they're up against is their neighbors and their associations and their, rules and regulations that come from the city. And so one of the things we just encourage folks to do is to really understand what the 3-year process is going to look like as you establish a prairie in an urban setting, and to make sure that you are making sure that that jives with the rules that are in place. So, the height of the grass that must be mowed and things like that. So it's becoming much more widely accepted. And I think that native look or native patches within an urban setting are much more common than they have been. But we still do hear from customers who have that challenge. So I think it's just understanding the expectations. It's a different beast than some of the other opportunities in wide open spaces.
Thank you. John, going back to wheat hybrids, do the quick guard types of wheat hybrids also have allelopathy?
I couldn't speak to that intelligently. Most of what we've used is common wheat or what's available here, and that's what, because it's cheap, is why they've used it for a nurse crop or a cover crop as well. There may be some that we don't have the problems with. I just don't know.
It's been a mixed result with like triticale. I'm assuming that may be what they're talking about, since it is a cross between wheat and rye. It can experience some tendencies, and I think a lot of that has to do with conditions, soil conditions and things like that and what's available, but you do still have the potential for that.
Mark, are there any special instructions for converting turfed rights-of-way into native habitat and future maintenance?
Well, if it's been turf a long time, I've seen that be one of the better situations to convert, although if it was managed turf where you had a lawn care service coming in and spraying out crabgrass control, we have seen a situation where the residues from the crabgrass control prevented germination of the meadows. So if you're going to convert a lawn area or a turf area, it's good to, if it's been in some sort of weed management program where they're trying to keep out crabgrass, suspend that for 1 year, and then it's Roundup, remove the litter, and plant, especially if there's no compaction. It's that simple.
Can I add to this, Caroline?
Please, Mike.
Okay, so just for the group, this is one of the things I do with a couple states and do recommendations for them on the right of ways, and it's exactly what Mark just said. Understanding that long-term turf grass, there has been many seasons of weeds that are there, that are established, that have just been kept mowed, that are kind of out of sight, out of mind, as well as seed banks that we do not know what's under there. So with John's presentation, with the multiple seasons of control, the fall, spring, summer, fall, or fall, spring, spring, fall, spring, is, in my opinion, the only way to be long-term successful, because once we remove the turf grass, it's kind of Pandora's box. We're not sure exactly what, weeds are there. We want to give them time to grow so that we can kill them off and exhaust that seed bank until we put those beneficial ones back in there. But once that turf grass has been removed and you have exhausted that seed source, you get very, very good stands. Soil type can be very variable along roadways, whereas you can go 5 feet and a different spoil could have been used. But that's also why natives are very beneficial in these sites, because they don't need as much of the nutrients, at least on the top. They get it through many different levels of the soil. So they tend to do very, very well. You may just have a little bit different height or densities from site condition to site condition.
Let me throw another part onto that. This also goes back to where I was saying, take a look at your surroundings. If I see problem weeds in the surrounding landscape, they will be there on the site. And the other thing to keep in mind is, it doesn't matter how many times I till the soil. If I've got a weed seed in the soil that has a 50-year persistence, I'm probably going to have a battle with that weed at least until I get the initial cover that keeps new weed seeds from germinating.
All right, thank you. And then, Jesse, does seed mix take into account aggressiveness of plant growth versus non-aggressive plants?
Yes, I would say, so much of that is dependent on your site condition. And what we see is that, in one space, a certain species may flourish and appear to outcompete something. And, in a different space, that same mix wouldn't do that. And so it isn't necessarily a game of numbers as it is matching the appropriate level of diversity and the appropriate species with the site. So, there are certain species that tend to be a little bit more, I guess, aggressive, but so much of that is dependent on what else is in the mix and what the site has. So, yes, all of those factors come into play when we, do the math behind a seed mix.
And I just want to point out, that's why to work with reputable seed companies and professionals that have experience in designing seed mixes, because they have that understanding to help build that for you. Because again, like what she said, is what you think is a perfect plant put in the wrong situation can be a nightmare to deal with.
Thank you. Okay, I just want to give the opportunity for anyone else to submit questions before we go ahead and end the webinar. You've got your question box, and it should be above the chat box if you have any questions to type in. All right, I want to thank all of the speakers for presenting today and working with me to put this together. Oh wait, I've got one more question. Okay. I've heard black-eyed Susans are not great for pollinators. Any other popular flowers that don't get visited much?
I want to put a word of caution on that one. When I design mixes, I use black-eyed Susan as an indicator. If black-eyed Susans and wild bergamot come up, which they're pretty easy seedlings to recognize, then you know you have a good stand in the making. With our cover crop and the wild rye we put in mixes, we've got large seeds. So I would be careful about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It can be very useful to know that things are going all right to keep the black-eyed Susans in. As far as other things that are going to bloom in that first year, I don't have anything good to suggest.
I would also add that, of course, that question is just so regional. So making sure that you work with your seed companies and making sure they understand that your priorities are to have pollinating species that have value. And I agree with the black-eyed Susan in that conversation. That's exactly why we include them in our pollinator mixes. But it is important to make sure that you're working with your local ecotype seed and your seed dealers to make sure you're getting those actual pollinating species in your pollinator mix.
Yeah, I concur. We use it quite a bit. We use it in our annual mixes as well, just for aesthetics. Again, if you're working in a public setting, people want to see results. Black-eyed Susans is one of the quickest, easiest ones to put out there to see it. You know what it's working. You know something's being done. And even though it may be quote unquote not a high value pollinator, it is still visited. It is still somewhat of a pollinator. So that is still up for long-term discussion.
I want to add one other thing on the whole pollinator front. There was a study that came out of Dartmouth University that complements some work done by Xerces. Xerces had some information. They were kind enough to look at some of the species we carry and evaluate them for their pollinator value. And I asked the person who did that, what was the basis for the rating? And they said, well, it's based on visits by pollinators. So we had a species, turtlehead, that grows in wetlands that had a moderate rating. But then the research out of Dartmouth University indicated that there's an alkaloid in the nectar that helps bumblebees get rid of mites, one of their parasites, when they drink the nectar of turtlehead. So just because something doesn't have a high pollinator value does not necessarily mean it's not very important to pollinators.
Thank you, everyone. I have one more question before we run out of time, and John, I am going to direct this one at you. Can you establish native prairie without herbicide use? And could you only use well-timed mowing?
The answer to that is yes. If you knew that you had a weed-free seed bed, that is the issue. We go into areas that have had no disturbance whatsoever, and we can change it from one type of native to the other, basically by just tillage. But when the invasives are there, it is very, very seldom that I have successful stands without some means to kill it. Now, Mark alluded earlier to disking and over, and that's what the old timers called keeping it black, keeping the soil black. So they depleted and depleted. So that is one method. Solarization on small areas where we put plastic down is another. But when we deal with a lot of nasty, mean stuff, then it is necessary.
John, we didn't have it at the symposium in the fall, but Rodale Institute was looking at a strategy that was organic. It may be better suited for some parts of the country than another, but if I recall it right, they were using multiple disc harrowings, followed up by planting with buckwheat. And as soon as the buckwheat was about to bloom, they would crimp it down with a cultipacker and drill through that with grain rye. And then they would follow that, I believe, they would cut the rye down the spring, and I believe they drilled at that point. Now, they were conducting an experiment on that. I don't know how it's turned out, but that is where the questioner might want to reach out to Rodale Institute and see how that's gone, how that experiment's turned out for them. But what I've given there is roughly what they were talking about for an organic approach.
And the ease of this is also going to be based off your regionality of what part of the country you're in as well.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much for your time and for your presentation. I want to remind all the listeners that we will take this recording and we will be putting it onto the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group website under the webinars page in just a few days. So with that, I am going to end the webinar. Thank you again.